Question 1. During the evaluation of a new manufacturing process for a company operating in Alabama, what is the most responsible and legally compliant approach to managing potential waste streams and emissions to prevent pollution, considering the requirements of the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM? Option A. Delay any formal consultation or notification to ADEM until the manufacturing process is fully operational and any potential environmental concerns have already manifested. Option B. Conduct a thorough environmental impact assessment. Consult with ADEM during the planning phase to understand specific permitting requirements and implement best available control technologies to minimize waste generation and emissions. Option C. Proceed with the manufacturing process, assuming existing waste disposal infrastructure will be adequate for any new byproducts, and address any potential pollution issues only if they become apparent. Option D. Select the least expensive waste disposal service available, without independently verifying its compliance with ADEM regulations for the specific types of waste anticipated from the new process. Correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough environmental impact assessment. Consult with ADEM during the planning phase to understand specific permitting requirements and implement best available control technologies to minimize waste generation and emissions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic interests of a business with the long-term environmental health and public well-being mandated by Alabama law. The pressure to minimize costs can conflict with the imperative to prevent pollution, especially when dealing with potentially hazardous waste. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, regulations, and to uphold ethical responsibilities. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively identifying and mitigating potential pollution risks associated with the new manufacturing process. This includes conducting a thorough environmental impact assessment, consulting with ADEM early in the planning stages, and implementing best available control technologies, backed, to prevent the generation or release of pollutants. This approach aligns directly with the principles of pollution prevention enshrined in Alabama's environmental statutes, such as the Alabama Environmental Management Act, which emphasizes the state's responsibility to protect its natural resources and public health through comprehensive regulatory oversight and the promotion of pollution control measures. Engaging with ADEM early demonstrates a commitment to compliance and allows for collaborative problem-solving, minimizing the risk of future violations and associated penalties. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the manufacturing process without a comprehensive assessment of potential waste streams and their environmental impact, relying solely on the hope that existing disposal methods will suffice. This fails to meet the proactive requirements of Alabama environmental law, which mandates responsible management of waste and emissions. It ignores the potential for novel pollutants or increased volumes that could exceed permitted limits or pose unforeseen risks to air, water, or soil. Another unacceptable approach is to prioritize cost savings by selecting the cheapest available waste disposal option, without verifying its compliance with ADEM regulations for the specific types of waste generated. This approach disregards the legal obligation to ensure that waste is treated, stored, and disposed of in a manner that protects human health and the environment, as stipulated by ADEM hazardous waste management rules. The potential for improper disposal leading to contamination and significant legal liabilities is high. A further incorrect approach is to delay consultation with ADEM until after the manufacturing process is operational and potential pollution issues have already arisen. This reactive stance undermines the collaborative spirit of environmental regulation and can lead to costly remediation efforts, enforcement actions, and reputational damage. Alabama law encourages early engagement to ensure that facilities are designed and operated in a manner that minimizes environmental impact from the outset. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based, proactive approach. This involves understanding the specific regulatory requirements of Alabama law, identifying potential environmental hazards associated with their operations, and implementing preventative measures. Consulting with regulatory agencies like ADEM early in the process is crucial for ensuring compliance and fostering a cooperative relationship. Ethical considerations demand prioritizing environmental protection and public health over short-term economic gains when there is a potential for harm. Question 2. Research into a proposed industrial development in Mobile County, Alabama, has revealed that the site may contain undiscovered archaeological artifacts due to its proximity to a historically significant Native American settlement. The development firm is eager to proceed quickly to capitalize on current market conditions. Which approach best balances the firm's economic interests with Alabama's environmental and historical preservation laws? Option A. Proceed with the development, conducting only a general environmental review, and address any historical findings that emerge during construction on a case-by-case basis. Option B. Commission a brief historical overview of the immediate project area, focusing only on above-ground structures, and assume no significant subsurface archaeological resources exist. Option C. Prioritize the immediate commencement of construction, with a commitment to undertake minimal, post-construction mitigation if any historical artifacts are incidentally discovered. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive archaeological and historical impact assessment by qualified consultants, integrating the findings into the environmental impact statement submitted to the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, and consulting with the Alabama Historical Commission regarding potential mitigation strategies. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive archaeological and historical impact assessment by qualified consultants, integrating the findings into the environmental impact statement submitted to the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, and consulting with the Alabama Historical Commission regarding potential mitigation strategies. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing economic development with the preservation of potentially significant historical and ecological resources, all within the specific legal framework of Alabama environmental law. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the scope and impact of the proposed development on a site with a known historical connection, necessitating a thorough understanding of Alabama's historical preservation and environmental impact assessment requirements. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with state statutes and regulations, avoid potential legal challenges, and uphold ethical responsibilities to protect both cultural heritage and the environment. The best approach involves a comprehensive environmental and historical impact assessment that specifically addresses the potential effects on the identified historical site. This approach is correct because Alabama law, particularly through the Alabama Historical Commission and the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, mandates consideration of historical resources in the planning and permitting of projects that may affect them. Engaging qualified historical consultants to conduct a detailed survey and assessment, and integrating their findings into the environmental impact statement submitted to ADEM ensures that potential impacts are identified, evaluated, and mitigated according to state requirements. This proactive and thorough method aligns with the spirit and letter of Alabama's environmental and historical preservation laws, aiming to prevent irreversible damage to cultural resources. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the development without a dedicated historical impact assessment, relying solely on a general environmental review. This is professionally unacceptable because it fails to acknowledge and address the specific legal obligations under Alabama law to consider historical sites. Such an oversight could lead to the inadvertent destruction of valuable historical artifacts or structures, resulting in significant legal penalties, public outcry, and potential project delays or cancellations. Another incorrect approach is to conduct a superficial historical review that only considers obvious above-ground structures, ignoring potential subsurface archaeological resources. This is professionally unacceptable as it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to understand the full scope of historical preservation requirements in Alabama. Archaeological sites, even if not immediately apparent, are protected under state law and require careful investigation. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to prioritize the economic benefits of the development over any potential historical findings, assuming that any historical concerns can be addressed later through minimal mitigation efforts. This is professionally unacceptable, as it violates the ethical obligation to protect historical resources and disregards the legal mandate for thorough impact assessment prior to project commencement. Alabama law requires a proactive approach to identifying and mitigating impacts, not a reactive one after potential damage has occurred. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of all applicable Alabama environmental and historical preservation statutes and regulations. This should be followed by a comprehensive site assessment that includes specialized historical and archaeological surveys conducted by qualified professionals. All findings must be integrated into a detailed impact assessment report, which is then submitted to the relevant state agencies, ADEM, and the Alabama Historical Commission, for review and approval. This systematic process ensures legal compliance, ethical conduct, and responsible stewardship of Alabama's historical and environmental resources. Question 3. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of significant water quality degradation and habitat disruption for the Black Warrior River due to a proposed new industrial facility. Which of the following approaches best addresses the requirements of Alabama environmental law for this situation? Option A. Implement a generic set of mitigation measures commonly used for industrial facilities, without conducting site-specific ecological surveys of the Black Warrior River. Option B. Conduct a detailed environmental impact assessment, IA, that includes comprehensive baseline studies of the river's water quality and aquatic ecosystems, identifies specific potential impacts from the facility's operations, and proposes tailored, robust mitigation measures to prevent or minimize these impacts. Option C. Rely on assurances from the industrial facilities developers that their existing pollution control technologies are sufficient and focus the EIA on documenting the economic benefits of the project. Option D. Prepare a basic environmental report that addresses only the direct discharge points and meets the minimum reporting thresholds stipulated by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, assuming that standard operational procedures will suffice. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed environmental impact assessment, IA, that includes comprehensive baseline studies of the river's water quality and aquatic ecosystems, identifies specific potential impacts from the facility's operations, and proposes tailored, robust mitigation measures to prevent or minimize these impacts. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for economic development with the imperative to protect Alabama's unique natural resources, specifically the Black Warrior River ecosystem. The Alabama Environmental Management Act, EMA, and its associated regulations, particularly those governing environmental impact assessments, IA, mandate a thorough and objective evaluation of potential environmental consequences before significant projects are approved. The core of the challenge lies in accurately predicting and mitigating impacts, ensuring that the EIA process is not merely a procedural hurdle, but a robust tool for informed decision-making that safeguards public health and environmental integrity. The best professional approach involves conducting a comprehensive EIA that rigorously assesses all potential impacts of the proposed industrial facility on the Black Warrior River. This includes detailed studies on water quality, aquatic life, sediment transport, and potential downstream effects. The EIA must also identify and propose specific, feasible mitigation measures that directly address the identified risks, such as advanced wastewater treatment technologies and riparian buffer zone restoration. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the EMA requirement for a thorough environmental review, emphasizing the proactive identification and management of environmental risks. It adheres to the principle of environmental stewardship by prioritizing the protection of the river ecosystem and its ecological functions, ensuring that any development proceeds with minimal adverse impact. An approach that focuses solely on meeting minimum regulatory reporting requirements without a deep dive into potential cumulative impacts is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a misunderstanding of the EIA's purpose, which is to anticipate and prevent harm, not just to document it. Such an approach risks overlooking subtle but significant long-term degradation of the river's health, violating the spirit and intent of the EMA. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to downplay or dismiss potential negative impacts based on anecdotal evidence or industry assurances without rigorous scientific data. This is ethically problematic as it prioritizes economic expediency over environmental protection and public safety. It fails to meet the EMA mandate for an objective assessment and could lead to irreversible environmental damage. Finally, an approach that relies heavily on generic mitigation strategies without tailoring them to the specific ecological characteristics of the Black Warrior River is also flawed. The EMA requires site-specific assessment and mitigation plans. Generic solutions may prove ineffective in addressing the unique vulnerabilities of this particular ecosystem, leading to inadequate protection and potential noncompliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the regulatory requirements under the EMA. This involves identifying all potential environmental receptors and stressors, followed by a systematic data collection and analysis process. The EIA should be iterative, allowing for refinement of impact predictions and mitigation strategies as new information emerges. Transparency and stakeholder engagement are also crucial components, ensuring that concerns are addressed and that the final decision is well-informed and defensible. Question 4. Strategic planning requires a developer proposing a new industrial facility in rural Alabama to consider the potential environmental consequences of their project. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of Alabama environmental law regarding impact assessment? Option A. Focus exclusively on meeting the explicit minimum regulatory standards set forth by a DEM for the specific pollutants anticipated, without undertaking broader ecological or health impact studies. Option B. Delay comprehensive public consultation and environmental impact disclosure until the project has received initial regulatory approval to avoid potential delays and opposition. Option C. Prioritize the economic benefits of the proposed facility and conduct only the minimum environmental reviews required by state law, assuming that economic growth will ultimately benefit the environment. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment that thoroughly evaluates potential adverse effects on air quality, water resources, biodiversity, and human health, engaging with a DEM and considering cumulative impacts from the outset. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment that thoroughly evaluates potential adverse effects on air quality, water resources, biodiversity, and human health, engaging with a DEM and considering cumulative impacts from the outset. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing economic development with the imperative to protect Alabama's unique natural resources and public health, as mandated by the Alabama Environmental Management Act (EMA) and its associated regulations. The decision-maker must navigate the complexities of impact assessment to ensure compliance and responsible stewardship. The best approach involves a comprehensive and proactive environmental impact assessment that thoroughly evaluates potential adverse effects on air quality, water resources, biodiversity, and human health within Alabama. This approach aligns with the EMA mandate to prevent, control, and abate pollution, and to protect the state's environment. It necessitates early engagement with regulatory agencies, such as the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, (ADEM), and consideration of cumulative impacts. This proactive stance ensures that potential environmental degradation is identified and mitigated before irreversible harm occurs, upholding the state's commitment to environmental protection and public well-being. An approach that prioritizes economic benefits without a rigorous assessment of environmental consequences is ethically and legally flawed. It fails to adhere to the EMA core principles of environmental protection and could lead to significant penalties, legal challenges, and long-term ecological damage. Such an approach disregards the state's responsibility to safeguard its natural heritage for present and future generations, focusing solely on compliance with minimum regulatory standards, while seemingly efficient, can be insufficient. Environmental law often requires a higher standard of care, particularly when dealing with sensitive ecosystems or potential public health risks. This approach risks overlooking potential long-term or cumulative impacts that might not be explicitly addressed by the most basic requirements, potentially leading to unforeseen environmental problems and reputational damage. An approach that delays or minimizes public consultation until late in the project lifecycle is professionally unsound. While the EMA emphasizes regulatory compliance, effective environmental management also involves transparency and stakeholder engagement. Failing to involve the public early can lead to opposition, delays, and a perception of disregard for community concerns, undermining the project's social license to operate and potentially creating conflicts that could have been avoided through earlier dialogue. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant Alabama environmental laws and regulations. This involves identifying all potential environmental impacts, assessing their significance, and developing appropriate mitigation strategies. Early and continuous engagement with regulatory bodies and stakeholders is crucial. A risk-based approach, prioritizing the protection of public health and sensitive ecosystems, should guide all decisions, ensuring that economic considerations are weighed against, not prioritized over, environmental protection. Question 5. Market research demonstrates that a new industrial development project in Alabama is planned near a critical migratory bird flyway. An environmental consultant is tasked with ensuring the project complies with all relevant environmental laws and regulations. Considering the United States' participation in international agreements for the protection of migratory birds, which of the following approaches best ensures comprehensive compliance for the Alabama-based project? Option A. Thoroughly research applicable international treaties concerning migratory birds, assess their implications for the project, and consult with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, and relevant federal agencies to integrate these obligations into the project's environmental impact assessment and permitting strategy. Option B. Assume that any international treaty obligations related to migratory birds are automatically incorporated into Alabama's environmental regulations without the need for separate verification. Option C. Prioritize adherence strictly to the current permitting requirements and guidelines issued by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, assuming these adequately address all environmental concerns. Option D. Proceed with the project design and permitting process based on state-level requirements, and address any potential international treaty conflicts only if they are explicitly raised by federal authorities during the review process. The correct answer is A. Thoroughly research applicable international treaties concerning migratory birds, assess their implications for the project, and consult with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, and relevant federal agencies to integrate these obligations into the project's environmental impact assessment and permitting strategy. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an environmental consultant in Alabama due to the complex interplay between state environmental regulations and international agreements. The consultant must navigate potential conflicts or ambiguities between the Alabama Department of Environmental Management's, ADEM, permitting requirements and the obligations undertaken by the United States under international treaties concerning migratory birds. Failure to properly consider these international commitments could lead to non-compliance with federal law, which often implements treaty obligations, and could result in significant penalties, project delays, or reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the proposed project not only meets ADEM standards, but also aligns with the broader environmental responsibilities of the United States. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively identifying and assessing the implications of relevant international treaties on the proposed project's environmental impact, particularly concerning migratory birds. This approach requires the consultant to research applicable treaties, such as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, MBTA, which implements international agreements like the Convention for the Protection of Migratory Birds between the United States and Great Britain, acting on behalf of Canada, and to consult with ADEM and potentially federal agencies, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to understand how these obligations are integrated into state permitting processes. This ensures that the project design and mitigation strategies are compliant with both state and federal requirements, which are informed by international commitments. This proactive and integrated approach is ethically sound and legally defensible, prioritizing comprehensive environmental stewardship. Incorrect approach is analysis. Focusing solely on ADEM current permitting requirements without considering international treaty obligations is professionally unacceptable. This approach risks overlooking federal mandates that stem from international agreements, potentially leading to violations of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act or other related federal laws. Such a failure could result in significant legal repercussions, including fines and injunctions, and would demonstrate a lack of due diligence. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to assume that ADEM regulations implicitly cover all international obligations. While state agencies often strive for consistency, there can be nuances or specific requirements mandated by federal law implementing treaties that are not fully mirrored in state regulations. Relying on this assumption without explicit confirmation could lead to non-compliance. Finally, attempting to bypass or ignore potential conflicts between state and international requirements by proceeding with the project without thorough investigation is ethically and legally unsound. This demonstrates a disregard for environmental law and international commitments, exposing the client and the consultant to substantial risks. Professional reasoning. Professionals in environmental consulting must adopt a comprehensive and proactive approach. This involves a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape at all applicable levels, federal, state, and international, when they have a bearing on a project. A robust decision-making framework includes 1. Identifying all relevant legal and regulatory frameworks, including international treaties that the United States is a party to and that have domestic implications. 2. Analyzing potential conflicts or overlaps between these frameworks. 3. Consulting with relevant regulatory bodies and experts to clarify requirements and ensure compliance. 4. Developing project plans and mitigation strategies that satisfy all applicable obligations. 5. Documenting all research, consultations, and decisions to demonstrate due diligence. Question 6. The assessment process reveals that a manufacturing facility in Alabama is considering adopting new waste management practices. While reviewing potential improvements, the facility's environmental compliance officer encounters a set of best practice guidelines issued by the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, concerning hazardous waste reduction. How should the compliance officer best integrate these UNEP guidelines into the facility's operational framework within Alabama? Option A. Analyze how the UNEP guidelines align with or could inform existing Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, regulations and state statutes, advocating for their adoption through appropriate state channels if beneficial. Option B. Disregard the UNEP guidelines entirely, asserting that only federal and state laws are relevant to environmental compliance in Alabama. Option C. Immediately implement the UNEP guidelines as if they were legally binding state regulations, assuming international best practices supersede state law. Option D. Prioritize the UNEP guidelines over any conflicting state statutes or ADEM regulations, believing international consensus dictates superior environmental standards. The correct answer is A. Analyze how the UNEP guidelines align with or could inform existing Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, regulations and state statutes, advocating for their adoption through appropriate state channels if beneficial. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent complexities of navigating international environmental initiatives within a specific state's regulatory framework. Alabama, like all U.S. states, operates under a dual sovereignty system where federal law often sets a baseline, but states retain significant authority to implement and enforce environmental protections. The challenge lies in understanding how international agreements or recommendations, even those from influential bodies like the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, interface with and potentially influence, but do not directly supersede, Alabama's own environmental laws and regulations. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to distinguish between aspirational international goals and legally binding state requirements. The correct approach involves recognizing that, while international agencies like UNEP provide valuable guidance, research, and frameworks for environmental protection, their pronouncements do not automatically become enforceable law within Alabama. Instead, Alabama's environmental laws, such as those administered by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, are the primary legal instruments governing environmental conduct within the state. Therefore, the most professional and legally sound approach is to analyze how UNEP recommendations might inform or align with existing Alabama statutes and regulations, and to advocate for their adoption or consideration through established state legislative and regulatory processes. This respects the sovereignty of Alabama's legal system while leveraging international expertise. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a UNEP recommendation, even if widely recognized internationally, directly imposes obligations on Alabama entities. This fails to acknowledge that environmental law in the United States is largely enacted and enforced at the federal and state levels. Acting as if a UNEP guideline has the force of Alabama law would lead to misinterpretations of legal duties and potential noncompliance with actual state requirements. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss UNEP work entirely, arguing that it has no relevance to Alabama's environmental management. This overlooks the significant role international bodies play in shaping best practices, scientific understanding, and the development of environmental policy globally. While not directly enforceable, UNEP reports and initiatives can offer valuable insights into emerging environmental issues and effective solutions that could be beneficial for Alabama to consider in its own regulatory development and enforcement strategies. A further incorrect approach would be to prioritize UNEP recommendations over explicit Alabama statutes or ADEM regulations when a conflict arises. This demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the hierarchy of laws and the principle of state autonomy in environmental regulation. Alabama's specific environmental laws and the regulations promulgated by ADEM are the definitive legal requirements that businesses and individuals must adhere to within the state. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should begin with a clear identification of the governing legal framework. In Alabama, this means consulting the Code of Alabama and ADEM regulations. Simultaneously, professionals should be aware of relevant international initiatives and their potential to inform policy. The critical step is to then bridge the gap. Assess how international recommendations align with, complement, or potentially highlight areas where Alabama's existing regulations might be enhanced or updated. This requires a diligent review of both domestic law and international guidance, with a clear understanding that domestic law holds ultimate authority for compliance within the state. Question 7. Which approach would be most effective for a new industrial facility operating in Alabama to ensure its operations are legally sound and contribute positively to the state's environmental well-being? Option A. Focus public relations efforts on highlighting the company's commitment to environmental sustainability while deferring substantive compliance measures until they become unavoidable. Option B. Rely primarily on general industry best practices for environmental management, assuming they meet Alabama's specific legal obligations without detailed verification. Option C. Proactively identify and meticulously adhere to all relevant Alabama environmental statutes, regulations, and permitting requirements, integrating compliance into all operational planning and seeking expert guidance. Option D. Minimize compliance costs by adopting only the most basic, legally defensible environmental practices, and only addressing issues if directly prompted by regulatory bodies. The correct answer is C. Proactively identify and meticulously adhere to all relevant Alabama environmental statutes, regulations, and permitting requirements, integrating compliance into all operational planning and seeking expert guidance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing economic development with the imperative to protect Alabama's natural resources and public health, as mandated by Alabama environmental law. A nuanced understanding of regulatory compliance and the broader societal importance of environmental protection is crucial for making sound decisions. The best approach involves proactively seeking comprehensive understanding and adherence to all applicable Alabama environmental statutes and regulations. This includes identifying all relevant permits, understanding reporting requirements, and implementing best management practices to minimize environmental impact. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the core purpose of Alabama environmental law, which is to safeguard the environment and public health through regulatory oversight and enforcement. Adhering to these laws demonstrates a commitment to corporate social responsibility and avoids potential legal penalties, reputational damage, and long-term environmental harm. An approach that prioritizes only immediate cost savings by circumventing or minimizing compliance efforts is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the Alabama Environmental Management Act and its associated regulations, which are designed to prevent pollution and protect ecosystems. Such an approach risks significant fines, legal action, and irreparable environmental damage, undermining the very societal benefits environmental law aims to secure. Another unacceptable approach is to rely solely on industry best practices without verifying their alignment with specific Alabama legal requirements. While industry standards can be helpful, they do not supersede statutory obligations. Failing to consult and comply with Alabama's specific environmental laws, such as those governing water quality or air emissions, constitutes a regulatory failure and exposes the entity to legal jeopardy. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on public relations without genuine commitment to environmental compliance is also professionally unsound. Environmental law in Alabama is not merely a public image issue. It is a legal and ethical mandate. Ignoring substantive compliance in favor of superficial public relations, efforts can lead to accusations of greenwashing and ultimately erode public trust, while still leaving the entity vulnerable to regulatory action. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific environmental laws and regulations applicable in Alabama. This involves consulting legal counsel and environmental experts, conducting comprehensive environmental impact assessments, and integrating compliance into all operational planning. Ethical considerations, including the long-term health of the community and the environment, should guide all decisions, ensuring that economic goals are pursued in a manner that respects and upholds environmental stewardship. Question 8. Investigation of a proposed commercial development project in Mobile County, Alabama, has raised questions about its environmental legal obligations. The project involves significant land clearing, grading, and the construction of several buildings, with potential for increased stormwater runoff. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with Alabama's environmental law regarding the definition and scope of environmental law? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the Alabama Environmental Management Act and relevant Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, regulations to determine if land clearing, grading, and stormwater management activities trigger any permitting requirements or fall under regulated activities. Option B. Focus solely on whether the development will directly discharge any industrial pollutants into the Mobile River. Option C. Assess environmental obligations based only on the immediate visual appearance of the construction site and any obvious debris. Option D. Limit the environmental assessment to only those activities explicitly classified as industrial or manufacturing under Alabama law. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of the Alabama Environmental Management Act and relevant Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, regulations to determine if land clearing, grading, and stormwater management activities trigger any permitting requirements or fall under regulated activities. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an understanding of the broad scope of Alabama environmental law, which extends beyond just direct pollution control to encompass land use, resource management, and public health considerations. The challenge lies in accurately identifying which activities fall under the purview of environmental law, especially when they have indirect environmental impacts. A misinterpretation could lead to non-compliance, fines, or missed opportunities for environmental stewardship. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive review of the Alabama Environmental Management Act, EMA, and related regulations to determine if the proposed development activities, including land clearing, construction, and potential runoff, trigger any permitting requirements or fall under the definition of activities regulated by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the statutory and regulatory framework governing environmental protection in Alabama. The EMA broadly defines environment and pollution to include conditions affecting public health and welfare, and its scope covers a wide range of activities that can impact air, water, and land resources. Consulting ADEM-specific rules and guidance documents for land-disturbing activities and stormwater management is crucial for ensuring compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. Focusing solely on whether the development directly discharges pollutants into a waterway is an incorrect approach because it narrowly interprets the scope of environmental law. Alabama's environmental laws, particularly the EMA, are designed to prevent pollution and protect environmental quality broadly, which includes managing land disturbance that can lead to erosion, sedimentation, and non-point source pollution. Ignoring potential impacts on soil water quality from runoff and habitat disruption would be a failure to comply with the comprehensive nature of environmental regulations. Limiting the assessment only to activities explicitly listed as industrial or manufacturing is also an incorrect approach. Environmental law in Alabama applies to a wide array of activities, not just traditional industrial processes. Land development, construction, and agricultural practices, among others, can have significant environmental consequences and are subject to regulation. This limited view risks overlooking significant environmental impacts and regulatory obligations. Considering only the immediate visual impact of the construction site, such as visible debris, without assessing potential long-term or indirect environmental consequences like soil erosion, groundwater contamination, or habitat fragmentation, represents a superficial understanding of environmental law. Environmental regulations are concerned with both immediate and cumulative impacts on the environment and public health, requiring a more thorough and forward-looking assessment. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a proactive and comprehensive approach. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant jurisdiction's environmental statutes and regulations, in this case, Alabama's EMA and ADEM rules. 2. Understanding the broad definitions of environment, pollution, and regulated activities within that jurisdiction. 3. Conducting a thorough assessment of all proposed activities, considering direct, indirect, and cumulative environmental impacts. 4. Consulting with regulatory agencies, ADEM, for clarification and to identify specific permitting or compliance requirements. 5. Prioritizing compliance with the spirit and letter of environmental laws to ensure protection of public health and the environment. Question 9. Assessment of a manufacturing facility in Mobile, Alabama, that has generated a new type of industrial sludge. The facility manager suspects this sludge may exhibit characteristics of hazardous waste due to its chemical composition, but has not yet conducted formal testing. The manager is eager to dispose of the sludge quickly to free up storage space. What is the most appropriate course of action for the facility manager to ensure compliance with Alabama environmental law? Option A. Immediately initiate the process for hazardous waste determination, including proper testing and characterization, and if classified as hazardous, follow all ADEM notification and manifesting requirements for disposal at a permitted hazardous waste facility. Option B. Mix the sludge with non-hazardous solid waste generated by the facility to dilute its potential hazardous characteristics before disposal at a municipal landfill. Option C. Arrange for the sludge to be disposed of at a privately owned, unpermitted industrial waste dump site to expedite the process. Option D. Proceed with disposal of the sludge at the local municipal solid waste landfill, assuming it is non-hazardous in the absence of definitive testing. The correct answer is A. Immediately initiate the process for hazardous waste determination, including proper testing and characterization, and if classified as hazardous, follow all ADEM notification and manifesting requirements for disposal at a permitted hazardous waste facility. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a waste management professional in Alabama to balance the immediate need for disposal with strict adherence to Alabama's environmental regulations, specifically concerning hazardous waste. Misinterpreting or circumventing these regulations can lead to significant legal penalties, environmental damage, and reputational harm for the company and the individual. The professional must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance, while also addressing the practicalities of waste disposal. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves identifying the waste stream as potentially hazardous based on its characteristics, and then proceeding with the rigorous notification and manifesting requirements mandated by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, under the Alabama Solid Waste Management and Disposal Act, and its associated administrative rules. This approach ensures that the waste is tracked from generation to final disposal, allowing ADEM to oversee its management and verify that it is handled at a permitted facility. This proactive identification and adherence to manifest procedures is the cornerstone of responsible hazardous waste management in Alabama, preventing improper disposal and mitigating environmental risks. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming the waste is non-hazardous without proper characterization and proceeding with disposal at a municipal solid waste landfill. This fails to comply with the Alabama Solid Waste Management and Disposal Act's requirements for identifying and managing hazardous waste. If the waste is indeed hazardous, this action constitutes illegal disposal and can result in severe penalties. Another incorrect approach is to attempt to dilute or mix the waste with non-hazardous materials to avoid hazardous waste classification. This practice is a direct violation of environmental regulations designed to prevent the circumvention of hazardous waste management protocols. Such actions are considered fraudulent and can lead to significant enforcement actions by ADEM. A third incorrect approach is to dispose of the waste at an unpermitted facility, even if it is believed to be non-hazardous. Alabama law strictly requires that all solid waste, and particularly hazardous waste, be disposed of at facilities permitted by ADEM. Disposal at an unpermitted site poses a direct threat to public health and the environment and is a clear violation of the Act. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama dealing with waste management should adopt a precautionary principle. When in doubt about the hazardous nature of a waste stream, it is always best to err on the side of caution and assume it is hazardous until proven otherwise through proper testing and characterization. This involves consulting ADEM guidance documents, understanding the definitions of hazardous waste under Alabama law, and implementing a robust waste characterization program. The decision-making process should prioritize regulatory compliance, environmental protection, and public safety, utilizing the manifest system as a critical tool for accountability. Question 10. Governance review demonstrates that a new commercial development project in Mobile County, Alabama, will involve the construction of a 50,000 square foot retail building, a 20,000 square foot parking lot, and 10,000 square feet of access roads. The total project boundary encompasses 15 acres. Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, regulations require a stormwater permit for developments exceeding 1 acre of impervious surface. If the existing site has 0.5 acres of impervious surface, what is the correct calculation to determine if a stormwater permit is required? Option A. Calculate the impervious surface area of only the new retail building 50,000 SQFT, convert it to acres, and compare it to the ADEM threshold of 1 acre. Option B. Calculate the total impervious surface area by summing the new retail building 50,000 SQFT, parking lot 20,000 SQFT, and access roads 10,000 SQFT. Convert this total to acres and compare it to the ADEM threshold of 1 acre. Option C. Assume a permit is required because the total project boundary is 15 acres, which is significantly larger than the 1 acre threshold. Option D. Calculate the total impervious surface area by summing the new construction 80,000 SQFT and the existing impervious surface 0.5 acres. Convert the combined area to acres and compare it to the ADEM threshold of 1 acre. The correct answer is B. Calculate the total impervious surface area by summing the new retail building 50,000 SQFT, parking lot 20,000 SQFT, and access roads 10,000 SQFT. Convert this total to acres and compare it to the ADEM threshold of 1 acre. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a precise understanding of Alabama's specific regulations regarding stormwater management and the calculation of impervious surface areas, which directly impacts permit requirements and potential penalties. Misinterpreting these regulations or miscalculating the area can lead to noncompliance, significant fines, and environmental harm. The need to balance development goals with environmental protection necessitates careful judgment. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves accurately calculating the total impervious surface area within the project boundary, and then determining the percentage of that area that exceeds the threshold for requiring a stormwater permit under Alabama law. This approach directly addresses the regulatory trigger for permit applicability. Alabama's Environmental Management Act and associated regulations, specifically those administered by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, mandate permits for certain levels of stormwater discharge, often tied to the amount of impervious surface. By calculating the total impervious area and comparing it to the permit threshold, one ensures compliance with the specific requirements of the state. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves only calculating the impervious area of the proposed new construction without considering the total project footprint. This fails to account for the cumulative impact of impervious surfaces within the entire development area, which is often the basis for regulatory thresholds in Alabama. This oversight could lead to underestimating the permit requirements. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any impervious surface automatically requires a permit, regardless of the total area. This is overly cautious and not aligned with the tiered regulatory approach typically found in Alabama environmental law, where permits are triggered by exceeding specific acreage or percentage thresholds. This approach leads to unnecessary administrative burden and cost. A further incorrect approach is to rely on general industry best practices for stormwater management, without verifying them against Alabama's specific ADEM regulations. While general practices are valuable, they do not substitute for understanding and adhering to the precise legal requirements of the state, which may have unique definitions or calculation methodologies. Professional reasoning. Professionals should first identify the relevant state agency, ADEM, and consult the most current version of Alabama's stormwater management regulations. They must then meticulously define impervious surface according to the state's definition and establish the project's total boundary. Calculations should be performed using precise measurements and appropriate mathematical formulas, such as the area of rectangles, circles, and polygons, to determine the total impervious surface area. This calculated area must then be compared against the specific thresholds outlined in Alabama law to determine permit obligations. If a permit is required, the application process must be followed diligently. Question 11. Governance review demonstrates a need to identify the primary sources of environmental law applicable to a new industrial facility in Alabama, which approach best ensures comprehensive legal understanding and compliance. Option A. Relying primarily on common law principles such as nuisance and trespass to address potential environmental impacts. Option B. Focusing exclusively on federal statutes and EPA regulation, as these represent the most comprehensive national standards. Option C. Systematically examining the U.S. Constitution, federal statutes and regulations, and then Alabama's specific environmental laws and regulations. Option D. Prioritizing Alabama's state environmental laws and regulations, assuming they supersede federal requirements for in-state operations. The correct answer is C. Systematically examining the U.S. Constitution, federal statutes and regulations, and then Alabama's specific environmental laws and regulations. Explanation. Governance review demonstrates a need to identify the primary sources of environmental law applicable to a new industrial facility in Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because accurately identifying the foundational legal authorities is critical for ensuring compliance, avoiding penalties, and establishing a robust environmental management system. Misinterpreting or overlooking key sources can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive approach that prioritizes the foundational legal framework established by the United States Constitution and then systematically examines federal statutes, regulations, and relevant state-level enactments. This approach is correct because the U.S. Constitution grants Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, which has been the basis for much federal environmental legislation. Federal statutes, such as the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, establish national standards and regulatory programs. Regulations promulgated by federal agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, provide the detailed rules for implementing these statutes. Alabama's own environmental laws and regulations, enacted by the state legislature and administered by agencies like the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, build upon or supplement federal requirements, often providing more stringent standards or addressing issues not covered at the federal level. This layered approach ensures all applicable legal obligations are identified. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on federal statutes and EPA regulations without considering the U.S. Constitution as the ultimate source of federal authority. This fails to acknowledge the constitutional underpinnings of federal environmental law and could lead to a superficial understanding of the legal basis. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize state laws and regulations over federal ones. While state laws are crucial, they often operate within the framework established by federal law and cannot contradict or be less stringent than federal mandates unless specifically permitted. Relying exclusively on common law principles like nuisance and trespass is also insufficient. While these can provide remedies for environmental harm, they are reactive and do not establish the proactive regulatory framework necessary for industrial operations. Professionals should employ a hierarchical decision-making process. First, identify the constitutional basis for environmental regulation. Second, thoroughly research and catalog all applicable federal statutes and their implementing regulations. Third, investigate Alabama's specific environmental statutes, administrative codes, and agency guidance documents. Finally, consider relevant common law principles as supplementary, but not primary, sources of environmental obligation. Question 12. Process analysis reveals that the manufacturing facility in Mobile, Alabama, is generating significant wastewater effluent containing specific chemical byproducts. The plant manager is tasked with addressing this issue, considering both operational costs and compliance with Alabama's environmental regulations regarding pollution prevention. Which of the following strategies represents the most responsible and effective approach? Option A. Investigate and implement process modification to reduce the generation of chemical byproducts at their source, alongside exploring opportunities for material substitution and process optimization to minimize waste. Option B. Install additional end-of-pipe treatment systems to further purify the wastewater before discharge, ensuring it meets the minimum permissible discharge limits set by Alabama's environmental agencies. Option C. Implement the most cost-effective pollution control technology available that meets current discharge regulations, without further investigation into source reduction or process efficiency. Option D. Lobby for a temporary waiver or extension on stricter effluent standards, citing the economic impact of implementing new pollution control technologies, and continue current operational practices. The correct answer is A. Investigate and implement process modifications to reduce the generation of chemical byproducts at their source, alongside exploring opportunities for material substitution and process optimization to minimize waste. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing economic pressures with environmental stewardship, a common ethical dilemma in industrial operations. The plant manager must make a decision that impacts both the company's financial health and its compliance with Alabama's environmental regulations, specifically concerning pollution prevention. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing interests responsibly. The best approach involves proactively identifying and implementing pollution prevention strategies that go beyond minimum compliance, focusing on source reduction and process modification. This aligns with the spirit and intent of Alabama's environmental laws, which encourage proactive measures to minimize pollution generation. Ethically, this demonstrates a commitment to corporate social responsibility and long-term sustainability, safeguarding public health and the environment. This approach is correct because it addresses the root causes of pollution, leading to more effective and sustainable environmental protection, and is often more cost-effective in the long run by reducing waste disposal and treatment costs. An approach that focuses solely on end-of-pipe treatment while meeting minimum regulatory standards is professionally unacceptable. This is because it treats the symptom rather than the cause of pollution. While it may satisfy immediate compliance requirements, it fails to embrace the proactive principles of pollution prevention mandated by Alabama's regulatory framework. Ethically, it represents a minimal effort and does not reflect a genuine commitment to environmental protection. Another unacceptable approach is to delay implementing any new pollution prevention measures until a regulatory violation occurs or is imminent. This reactive stance is risky and can lead to significant penalties, reputational damage, and potential harm to the environment. It demonstrates a lack of foresight and a disregard for the precautionary principle inherent in environmental law. Finally, an approach that prioritizes cost savings by opting for the cheapest, least effective pollution control methods, even if they meet minimum standards, is also professionally flawed. This approach may technically comply with regulations, but fails to achieve the desired outcomes of pollution prevention and environmental protection. It can lead to ongoing environmental degradation and may not be sustainable in the long term, potentially requiring more costly interventions later. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of applicable Alabama environmental laws and regulations, particularly those related to pollution prevention. This should be followed by a comprehensive assessment of operational processes to identify opportunities for source reduction and waste minimization. Evaluating the long-term economic and environmental benefits of various pollution prevention strategies, rather than just immediate costs, is crucial. Engaging with environmental experts and considering best practices within the industry will further inform responsible decision-making. Question 13. The performance metrics show a significant increase in environmental liabilities for a manufacturing facility in Mobile, Alabama, following a recent spill of industrial solvents. As the environmental consultant overseeing the site, you are aware that a comprehensive site assessment will likely trigger extensive and costly remediation under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act (CERCLA) and Alabama's environmental regulations. Your client is strongly advocating for a minimal cost approach that focuses only on immediate containment, arguing that a full investigation might reveal more than is legally required to address. What is the most ethically and legally sound course of action? Option A. Advise the client to delay reporting the full extent of the spill to a DEM, suggesting they wait to see if further environmental impacts become apparent before initiating a comprehensive investigation. Option B. Implement only immediate containment measures for the spill and present this as a sufficient response to a DEM, downplaying the potential for widespread soil and groundwater contamination. Option C. Provide a DEM with a report that selectively highlights less concerning data points from preliminary testing, omitting critical information about solvent migration that could significantly increase remediation costs. Option D. Conduct a thorough site assessment to fully characterize the extent of contamination. Report all findings accurately to the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, a DEM, and collaborate with a DEM to develop a compliant remediation plan. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough site assessment to fully characterize the extent of contamination. Report all findings accurately to the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, a DEM, and collaborate with a DEM to develop a compliant remediation plan. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire to minimize financial liability and the ethical and legal obligations to address environmental contamination under CERCLA. The pressure to avoid costly remediation efforts can lead to decisions that prioritize short-term financial gains over long-term environmental protection and public health, creating a complex ethical dilemma for the environmental consultant. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing interests while adhering to legal mandates and professional ethics. The best professional approach involves a thorough and transparent assessment of the site's contamination, followed by a proactive engagement with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, a DEM, to develop a compliant remediation plan. This approach prioritizes adherence to CERCLA requirements for identifying and addressing hazardous substances, as well as Alabama's specific environmental regulations. By working collaboratively with a DEM, the consultant ensures that the remediation efforts meet all legal standards, minimizes potential future liabilities for the client, and protects public health and the environment. This aligns with the ethical duty of an environmental professional to act with integrity and competence, prioritizing public welfare, an approach that focuses solely on minimizing immediate remediation costs by downplaying the extent of contamination or proposing superficial solutions is professionally unacceptable. This failure to conduct a comprehensive assessment and to fully disclose findings to a DEM directly violates CERCLA mandate for thorough response actions and Alabama's regulatory oversight. Such an approach risks significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and continued environmental harm. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to delay reporting or remediation efforts in the hope that the issue will be overlooked or that future regulatory changes might be more favorable. This inaction is a clear violation of CERCLA reporting requirements and Alabama's environmental laws, which mandate timely action upon discovery of hazardous substances. It demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and in disregard for the potential harm to human health and the environment. Finally, an approach that involves selectively presenting data to a DEM, omitting critical findings that indicate significant contamination, is unethical and illegal. This misrepresentation undermines the regulatory process, obstructs effective environmental management, and can lead to severe legal consequences for both the consultant and the client. It violates the fundamental ethical principle of honesty and transparency in professional practice. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of their legal and ethical obligations under CERCLA and Alabama environmental law. This involves prioritizing accurate data collection and analysis, maintaining open and honest communication with regulatory agencies, and advocating for remediation strategies that are both effective and compliant. When faced with pressure to compromise these principles, professionals should rely on their ethical codes and legal responsibilities, seeking guidance from legal counsel or professional organizations if necessary. Question 14. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a proposed commercial development in Mobile County, Alabama, may involve activities impacting wetlands that are considered waters of the United States. Given the primacy of national legislation in this area, what is the most appropriate course of action for the developer to ensure compliance with federal environmental law? Option A. Argue that the project's significant economic benefits to the Mobile County region justify an exemption from federal wetland regulations. Option B. Proactively consult with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USACE, to determine the specific permitting requirements under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act and secure necessary authorizations before commencing any work. Option C. Begin construction and address any potential environmental impacts or permitting issues as they arise during the development process. Option D. Proceed with the development after obtaining all necessary state and local permits, assuming federal oversight is adequately addressed by state agencies. The correct answer is B. Proactively consult with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USACE, to determine the specific permitting requirements under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act and secure necessary authorizations before commencing any work. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic interests of a development project with the long-term environmental protection mandates of federal legislation, specifically the Clean Water Act, as it applies in Alabama. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying complex federal regulations to a specific state context, ensuring compliance without unduly hindering legitimate economic activity. Careful judgment is required to navigate potential conflicts between state and federal authority and to identify the most effective and legally sound path forward. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively engaging with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USACE, to determine the specific permitting requirements under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the federal mandate for regulating discharges of dredged or fill material into waters of the United States, including wetlands. By initiating early consultation with the relevant regulatory bodies, the developer can ensure that their project plans align with federal requirements, identify potential mitigation needs, and secure the necessary permits before commencing any activity that could lead to violations. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of costly delays, fines, and project redesigns, and demonstrates a commitment to environmental compliance. Incorrect approach is analysis. Pursuing the project without any federal consultation, assuming state-level approvals are sufficient, is professionally unacceptable. This approach fails to recognize that the Clean Water Act is a federal law that preempts state law in areas it covers, and that discharges into navigable waters and wetlands require federal permits, regardless of state authorization. Proceeding without federal permits risks significant legal penalties, injunctions, and mandated restoration efforts. Another unacceptable approach is to proceed with the project and address potential environmental impacts only after construction has begun, relying on the hope that any issues can be resolved reactively. This reactive strategy is ethically and legally flawed, as it violates the principle of obtaining permits before engaging in regulated activities. It also increases the likelihood of encountering unforeseen environmental damage that is more difficult and expensive to remediate. Finally, attempting to circumvent federal requirements by arguing that the project's economic benefits outweigh environmental concerns is not a legally valid defense under the Clean Water Act. Environmental laws are designed to protect public resources, and economic benefit alone does not grant exemption from regulatory compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. First, identify all applicable federal, state, and local environmental laws and regulations. Second, determine the specific regulatory requirements for the proposed activity, including any necessary permits. Third, consult with the relevant regulatory agencies early in the planning process to understand their expectations and requirements. Fourth, develop a compliance strategy that integrates environmental protection measures and permit acquisition into the project timeline. Fifth, document all communications and actions taken to ensure compliance. This systematic approach prioritizes legal adherence and responsible environmental stewardship. Question 15. The audit findings indicate that a proposed commercial development project in Mobile County, Alabama, may impact the habitat of the endangered Red Hills salamander. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the development firm to undertake to address potential ESA violations? Option A. Proceed with the development as planned, assuming the impact on the Red Hills salamander population will be negligible and not require federal review. Option B. Initiate consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to conduct a biological assessment, and if necessary, develop a habitat conservation plan to mitigate potential impacts. Option C. Undertake internal environmental reviews to determine the extent of the salamander's habitat on the property, and proceed with development if the impact appears manageable without external consultation. Option D. Immediately halt all project activities and abandon the site due to the potential presence of an endangered species, without further investigation or consultation. The correct answer is B. Initiate consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to conduct a biological assessment, and if necessary, develop a habitat conservation plan to mitigate potential impacts. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential conflict between a proposed development project in Alabama and the presence of a federally listed endangered species. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing economic development interests with stringent federal environmental protections under the Endangered Species Act (ESA). Failure to navigate this conflict appropriately can lead to significant legal penalties, project delays, and reputational damage for the developer and its consultants. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance while exploring viable project alternatives. The best approach involves proactively engaging with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service (USFWS) to conduct a thorough biological assessment, and if necessary, develop a habitat conservation plan (HCP). This approach is correct because it directly addresses the requirements of Section 7 of the ESA, which mandates federal agencies to ensure their actions do not jeopardize endangered species or their critical habitats. By initiating consultation and assessment early, the developer demonstrates a commitment to compliance and allows for the exploration of mitigation strategies that can minimize impacts. An HCP, when required, provides a framework for managing incidental take of the species, offering regulatory certainty. This proactive engagement is ethically sound as it prioritizes species protection and adheres to the spirit and letter of the law. An approach that involves proceeding with the development without consulting the USFWS and assuming no significant impact is incorrect. This ignores the explicit requirements of the ESA for federal agency consultation and the potential for significant harm to listed species. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for environmental stewardship and legal obligations. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to obscure or downplay the presence of the endangered species in project documentation. This is not only unethical, constituting a form of deception, but also carries severe legal consequences under the ESA, including fines and injunctions. It undermines the transparency necessary for effective environmental regulation. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on minimizing project costs by avoiding any mitigation measures, even if impacts are identified, is professionally unacceptable. While cost is a factor, it cannot supersede legal requirements and ethical responsibilities to protect endangered species. This approach risks significant legal repercussions and demonstrates a lack of commitment to responsible development. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant environmental laws, such as the ESA. This involves identifying potential conflicts early in the project lifecycle. The next step is to consult with regulatory agencies, like the USFWAs, to understand their requirements and expectations. Developing a strategy that prioritizes compliance, explores mitigation options, and seeks to integrate environmental considerations into project design is crucial. This process should be transparent, well-documented, and informed by expert advice. Question 16. The evaluation methodology shows that a chemical manufacturing company in Alabama has discovered an undocumented chemical intermediate that was previously manufactured on-site. Considering the requirements of the Toxic Substances Control Act (TSCA), as administered by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which of the following actions represents the most responsible and legally compliant approach for the company? Option A. Continue manufacturing the chemical intermediate while conducting an internal investigation to determine if it poses any environmental or health risks, without informing the EPA until the investigation is complete. Option B. Assume the chemical intermediate is exempt from TSCA reporting requirements because it is not a final product and continue manufacturing without further action. Option C. Immediately notify the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, of the discovery, providing all available information about the chemical intermediate and seeking guidance on its regulatory status and any necessary reporting or compliance actions. Option D. Discreetly dispose of the undocumented chemical intermediate to avoid potential regulatory scrutiny and associated costs. The correct answer is C. Immediately notify the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, of the discovery, providing all available information about the chemical intermediate and seeking guidance on its regulatory status and any necessary reporting or compliance actions. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that a chemical manufacturing company operating in Alabama is facing a potential violation of the Toxic Substances Control Act (TSCA) due to the discovery of an undocumented, previously manufactured chemical intermediate. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves balancing the company's operational needs and potential liabilities with strict federal environmental regulations. The discovery of an undocumented substance, even if an intermediate, raises immediate concerns about compliance, reporting, and potential risks to human health and the environment under TSCA. Careful judgment is required to determine the appropriate course of action that minimizes legal exposure and upholds ethical responsibilities. The best professional practice in this situation involves proactively engaging with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, to report the discovery and seek guidance on compliance. This approach is correct because TSCA, as implemented by the EPA, mandates reporting for new chemical substances and significant new uses of existing substances. By immediately notifying the EPA, the company demonstrates a commitment to transparency and compliance, which can mitigate penalties and foster a cooperative relationship. This aligns with the ethical principle of acting with integrity and fulfilling legal obligations. The company should be prepared to provide detailed information about the chemical's identity, manufacturing process, intended use, and any known or suspected risks. An incorrect approach would be to assume the intermediate is exempt from reporting requirements simply because it is not a final product. TSCA reporting obligations can extend to intermediates, especially if they are isolated or have the potential for release. Failing to report could lead to significant penalties, including fines and injunctions, and would demonstrate a disregard for the law. Another incorrect approach is to attempt to dispose of the undocumented chemical intermediate without proper investigation or notification. This action could be construed as an attempt to conceal noncompliance and could lead to severe legal repercussions, including criminal charges, in addition to environmental damage. TSCA and related waste disposal regulations require careful handling and reporting of chemical substances. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to ignore the discovery and continue manufacturing without addressing the compliance issue. This passive stance is professionally unacceptable, as it directly violates the spirit and letter of TSCA, which aims to regulate chemical substances throughout their life cycle. It exposes the company to substantial future liabilities and reputational damage. Professionals in such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance, ethical conduct, and risk mitigation. This involves 1. Immediate internal assessment to understand the nature and scope of the issue. 2. Consulting with legal and environmental compliance experts. 3. Proactively engaging with regulatory bodies like the EPA. And 4. Developing a comprehensive plan to address any identified noncompliance and prevent future occurrences. Question 17. What factors determine the legality and safety of a pesticide application in Alabama when using a product registered under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act (FIFRA)? Option A. The specific instructions, restrictions, and warnings provided on the pesticide's EPA-approved product label. Option B. General knowledge of common pesticide application practices and their intended uses. Option C. The assumption that any federally registered pesticide can be used for its general purpose without specific label adherence. Option D. Recommendations from other pesticide applicators or general industry publications. The correct answer is A. The specific instructions, restrictions, and warnings provided on the pesticide's EPA-approved product label. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pesticide applicator in Alabama to navigate the complex interplay between federal FIFRA requirements and state-specific implementation. The applicator must understand not just the general principles of pesticide use, but also the specific labeling requirements and the potential for state-level restrictions or additional guidance that might impact the legality and safety of their application. Misinterpreting or ignoring these requirements can lead to significant legal penalties, environmental damage, and harm to human health, making careful judgment and thorough research paramount. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously reviewing the specific product label for the pesticide being used, paying close attention to all instructions, restrictions, and warnings. This approach is correct because FIFRA mandates that all pesticide labels are legally binding. The label provides the definitive guidance on how, where, and when a pesticide can be legally applied, including specific crop tolerances, application rates, buffer zones, and environmental precautions. In Alabama, while the Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries, ADI, oversees pesticide regulation, their authority is largely to enforce FIFRA and implement its provisions. Therefore, adherence to the federal label, as approved by the EPA, is the primary legal obligation. Incorrect approaches analysis. Relying solely on general knowledge of pesticide application without consulting the specific product label is professionally unacceptable. This approach fails because general knowledge cannot account for the unique properties, risks, and legal restrictions associated with each individual pesticide formulation. It bypasses the legally binding nature of the label, which is the cornerstone of FIFRA compliance. Assuming that if a pesticide is registered federally, it can be used in any manner consistent with its general purpose, without regard to specific label instructions, is also a failure. This ignores the fact that FIFRA registration is contingent upon adherence to the approved label. Deviating from the label constitutes an unlawful use under FIFRA, regardless of the pesticide's general registration status. Using a pesticide based on recommendations from a fellow applicator or a general industry publication, without verifying against the product's specific label, is another professionally unsound approach. While peer advice can be helpful, it does not supersede the legal requirements of the pesticide label. Such reliance can lead to the propagation of incorrect or outdated information, resulting in non-compliance and potential harm. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama, when dealing with pesticide application under FIFRA, should adopt a systematic decision-making process. This process begins with identifying the specific pesticide product to be used. The next critical step is to obtain and thoroughly read the product's EPA-approved label. This label serves as the primary legal document. Professionals must then cross-reference any state-specific regulations or guidance from the Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries to ensure full compliance. If any discrepancies or ambiguities arise, seeking clarification from the manufacturer or the ADI is essential before proceeding with application. This methodical approach ensures legal compliance, environmental protection, and public safety. Question 18. The control framework reveals that a manufacturing facility in Mobile, Alabama, has begun generating a new waste stream from a recently modified production process. While the waste appears visually similar to previously managed non-hazardous materials, facility management is uncertain about its exact composition and potential hazardous characteristics under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA). What is the most appropriate initial step for the facility to take to ensure compliance with Alabama's environmental regulations? Option A. Assume the waste is non-hazardous due to its visual similarity to existing non-hazardous waste streams and continue managing it under current non-hazardous protocols. Option B. Immediately conduct thorough laboratory analysis of the new waste stream to determine if it exhibits any RCRA hazardous characteristics, ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, or toxicity, and manage it as hazardous waste until definitively classified otherwise. Option C. Rely on the informal opinion of the production supervisor, who believes the waste is unlikely to be hazardous based on their experience with similar processes. Option D. Postpone any formal waste characterization until a regulatory inspection occurs, at which point the facility will address any concerns raised. The correct answer is B. Immediately conduct thorough laboratory analysis of the new waste stream to determine if it exhibits any RCRA hazardous characteristics, ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, or toxicity, and manage it as hazardous waste until definitively classified otherwise. Explanation. The control framework reveals a common challenge in environmental compliance: balancing operational efficiency with strict adherence to hazardous waste regulations. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) as implemented in Alabama, specifically concerning the management of newly identified hazardous waste streams. A failure to correctly classify and manage these wastes can lead to significant environmental harm, substantial fines, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all regulatory obligations are met without unduly hindering legitimate business operations. The best professional practice involves a proactive and thorough assessment of the waste stream against RCRA criteria. This approach prioritizes accurate identification and classification of the waste, followed by the implementation of appropriate management and disposal procedures as mandated by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, under RCRA. This ensures compliance with 40 CFR Parts 260-279 as adopted by Alabama by treating the waste as hazardous until definitively proven otherwise through rigorous testing and analysis. This aligns with the precautionary principle inherent in environmental law, aiming to prevent potential harm before it occurs. An incorrect approach would be to assume the waste is non-hazardous based on its appearance or a cursory understanding of the process. This fails to acknowledge the potential for constituents to exhibit hazardous characteristics, ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, or toxicity, even if not immediately obvious. Such an assumption directly contravenes RCRA mandate for generators to determine if their waste is hazardous, potentially leading to improper disposal and violations of Alabama's hazardous waste management regulations. Another unacceptable approach is to delay the classification process indefinitely, continuing to manage the waste in a manner that may not be compliant with hazardous waste requirements. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for regulatory timelines and responsibilities. It exposes the facility to liability for past noncompliance and creates an ongoing risk of environmental contamination. Finally, an approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of non-expert personnel regarding the waste's hazardous nature is professionally unsound. RCRA requires objective, scientifically defensible methods for waste characterization. Relying on informal assessments bypasses the necessary analytical steps and regulatory scrutiny, increasing the likelihood of misclassification and subsequent noncompliance with Alabama's environmental laws. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making framework that begins with understanding the regulatory obligations under RCRA and Alabama's specific implementation. This involves 1. Identifying all waste streams generated, 2. Consulting relevant regulations and guidance documents, 3. Conducting thorough waste characterization through laboratory analysis if necessary, 4. Classifying the waste based on regulatory criteria, 5. Implementing appropriate management, storage, transportation, and disposal procedures, and 6. Maintaining detailed records of all activities. This structured approach ensures compliance and minimizes environmental and legal risks. Question 19. Quality control measures reveal that a manufacturing facility in Mobile County, Alabama, proposes to discharge treated wastewater containing trace amounts of a specific industrial chemical. While the concentration of this chemical in the discharge is below the numerical effluent limitation established in the facility's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System (NPDES) permit. Preliminary environmental assessment suggests the chemical could be toxic to certain aquatic organisms indigenous to the receiving stream, potentially impacting the stream's designated use for supporting aquatic life. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with Alabama's water quality standards? Option A. Conduct a detailed ecological risk assessment to evaluate the potential toxicity and bioaccumulation of the chemical in the receiving stream, comparing the findings against Alabama's narrative water quality criteria for aquatic life protection, in addition to confirming the numerical effluent limitation is met. Option B. Proceed with the discharge as planned, relying solely on the fact that the discharge's concentration of the chemical is below the numerical effluent limitation specified in the NPDES permit. Option C. Prioritize the facility's economic feasibility by proceeding with the discharge, provided the cost of additional treatment to further reduce the chemical concentration is deemed prohibitive, without further environmental impact analysis. Option D. Assume that any discharge meeting its numerical effluent limitation automatically complies with all Alabama water quality standards, including narrative criteria. Correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed ecological risk assessment to evaluate the potential toxicity and bioaccumulation of the chemical in the receiving stream, comparing the findings against Alabama's narrative water quality criteria for aquatic life protection, in addition to confirming the numerical effluent limitation is met. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic interests of a facility with the long-term public health and environmental protection mandates of Alabama's water quality standards. Misinterpreting or misapplying these standards can lead to significant legal penalties, environmental damage, and reputational harm. The core challenge lies in accurately assessing whether the proposed discharge, even if below a specific numerical limit, could still violate the narrative criteria designed to protect aquatic life and human health. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive assessment that considers both the numerical effluent limitations and the narrative water quality standards as defined by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management (ADEM). This approach recognizes that Alabama's regulations, particularly under the Alabama Water Pollution Control Act and associated administrative rules, e.g., ADEM Admin Code R 335-6-10, are designed to protect the designated uses of state waters. Even if a discharge meets a specific numerical limit for a pollutant, if it causes or contributes to a violation of narrative criteria such as toxicity to aquatic life, impairment of the natural aesthetic conditions, or the creation of a nuisance, it is non-compliant. Therefore, a thorough evaluation of the potential for toxicity, bioaccumulation, or other adverse effects on the receiving stream's ecosystem is paramount. This aligns with a ADEM mandate to ensure that all discharges do not degrade water quality below established standards. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on meeting the numerical effluent limitation for a specific pollutant without considering its potential impact on the narrative water quality standards. This fails to acknowledge that narrative criteria are intended to provide a broader level of protection against a wider range of potential harms, including those not explicitly quantified by numerical limits or those that manifest as synergistic effects. Alabama's regulations are designed to prevent any discharge that causes pollution, which is broadly defined to include any alteration of the physical, chemical, or biological properties of any state waters. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because the discharge is within the permitted limits, it automatically complies with all water quality standards. Permitted limits are often derived from specific numerical criteria, but they must also be protective of the overall designated uses of the receiving waters, which are informed by narrative standards. This approach overlooks the possibility that a discharge, even if seemingly compliant with a single parameter, could cumulatively or synergistically impact the water body's ability to support aquatic life or be used for other beneficial purposes. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize the economic feasibility of the facility over potential environmental impacts without a proper regulatory basis. While economic considerations are sometimes factored into the development of certain regulatory provisions, the fundamental requirement is to meet water quality standards. A decision to proceed with a discharge based solely on cost-effectiveness, without a rigorous demonstration of compliance with both numerical and narrative standards, would be a direct violation of Alabama's environmental protection laws. Professional reasoning. Professionals must adopt a precautionary principle when assessing compliance with water quality standards. This involves a proactive and thorough evaluation of all potential impacts, not just those easily measured. The decision-making process should begin with a clear understanding of the designated uses of the receiving water body and the specific numerical and narrative water quality standards applicable to those uses under Alabama law. Any proposed discharge should be rigorously evaluated against these standards, utilizing all available data, and if necessary, conducting further testing to assess potential toxicity or other adverse effects. When in doubt, consulting with a DEM or seeking expert environmental assessment is crucial to ensure compliance and protect public health and the environment. Question 20. Quality control measures reveal that a historical industrial site in Mobile, Alabama, contaminated between 1975 and 1985, is now subject to a complex remediation effort. 3 parties are identified as potentially responsible. Party A operated the facility from 1975–1980. Party B purchased the facility and operated it from 1980–1985. And Party C acquired the land in 1990 and is the current owner. To determine the fair allocation of remediation costs, which approach most accurately reflects the historical development of environmental law in Alabama and ensures a legally defensible outcome. Option A. Allocate costs solely based on the current Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, remediation standards, and the proportion of current property value each party might be deemed to influence, irrespective of their historical involvement or the laws in place at the time of contamination. Option B. Allocate costs based on the current market value of the land and the extent to which each party's current land use contributes to the ongoing migration of contaminants, disregarding any specific historical operational data or the environmental laws that were applicable during the contamination period. Option C. Allocate costs based on a detailed analysis of Alabama environmental statutes and regulations in effect between 1975 and 1985. Considering the operational activities and waste generation of parties, A and B during their respective periods of ownership and operation, and factoring in any documented financial contributions or agreements made under those historical laws. Option D. Allocate costs by dividing the total remediation expense equally among parties A, B, and C, assuming all parties share equal responsibility due to the current contamination, without regard to their specific historical actions or the legal framework at the time. The correct answer is C. Allocate costs based on a detailed analysis of Alabama environmental statutes and regulations in effect between 1975 and 1985, considering the operational activities and waste generation of parties A and B during their respective periods of ownership and operation, and factoring in any documented financial contributions or agreements made under those historical laws. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in environmental consulting by requiring the application of historical Alabama environmental law principles to a contemporary remediation cost allocation problem. The difficulty lies in accurately interpreting and applying potentially outdated regulatory frameworks to modern financial and technical realities, necessitating a deep understanding of how Alabama's environmental legal landscape has evolved. Careful judgment is required to ensure that cost allocation is both legally defensible under the historical context and practically equitable. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a meticulous review of Alabama's historical environmental statutes and regulations in effect at the time of the alleged contamination, alongside a comparative analysis of the financial contributions made by each party during that period. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the core of historical liability under Alabama law. Specifically, it aligns with the principle of allocating responsibility based on the legal and regulatory standards that governed environmental conduct at the time the actions leading to contamination occurred. This method ensures that the cost allocation is grounded in the prevailing legal framework, preventing the retroactive application of more stringent modern standards. It also acknowledges the financial realities and contributions made by parties under those historical conditions, promoting fairness and legal precedent. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves solely applying current Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, remediation standards and cost-sharing models without considering the historical context. This is professionally unacceptable because it fails to respect the principle of non-retroactivity of laws and regulations. Environmental statutes and their enforcement priorities have significantly changed in Alabama since the initial contamination events, and applying today's standards to past actions would be legally flawed and inequitable. Another incorrect approach is to base cost allocation solely on the current market value of the contaminated property, irrespective of historical contributions or regulatory compliance at the time of contamination. This is professionally unacceptable as it ignores the fundamental principles of environmental liability, which often tie responsibility to the actions or omissions that cause the pollution, not merely the present-day value of the affected asset. Alabama environmental law, even in its historical development, has focused on causation and responsibility for the pollution itself. A further incorrect approach is to rely on anecdotal evidence or informal agreements made between parties decades ago without corroborating documentation or legal standing under the environmental laws of that era. This is professionally unacceptable because it lacks the rigorous evidentiary basis required for legal and financial settlements. Historical environmental law in Alabama, like in other jurisdictions, requires adherence to established legal procedures and documentation for liability and cost allocation. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a scenario should adopt a systematic, evidence-based approach. First, identify the specific period of alleged contamination and research the Alabama environmental statutes, regulations, and ADEM guidance documents that were in effect during that time. Second, gather all available documentation related to the parties' activities, waste disposal practices, and any financial contributions or agreements made during that historical period. Third, conduct a comparative analysis of these historical factors against the current legal and technical remediation requirements. Fourth, consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama environmental law to ensure the proposed cost allocation is legally sound and defensible. This structured process ensures that decisions are grounded in historical legal realities, promoting fairness and compliance.